I'm making this video because I was frustrated with the lack of information about console aiming techniques. So I was forced to scour the internet and try to find any information about how aiming techniques work. And after a few hours of looking through Reddit posts, YouTube videos, and Blizzard forum posts, I finally felt like I was confident in answering the question on how each aiming technique works. So let's start off with the first aiming technique, linear ramp. So linear ramp is just a one-to-one curve. So what that means is if you tilt your thumbstick 25% to the right, you will turn at 25% speed. It's just a one-to-one, right? So now that we know the definition of linear ramp, let's talk about the pros and cons. And let's start off with the pros. So the first pro of linear ramp is its responsiveness. And because linear ramp is a one-to-one, that makes it one of, if not the most responsive aiming technique. And that can be very, very useful in a game like Overwatch, where you need to respond to movements very, very quickly, especially on a character like Tracer. It is very, very important to be responsive. So now let's go into the second pro of linear ramp. And the second pro is that it's very good at aiming up close. So the way that linear ramp works, it just allows you to do very fine adjustments up close, right? And that's something that some of the other aiming techniques lack. And it's a really, really big advantage for characters that are in your face, up close and personal with you. But now that we covered the pros of linear ramp, let's talk about the cons. So the first con is linear ramp tends to struggle at mid to long range. But that doesn't mean if you use linear ramp, then you're just automatically doomed at mid to long range. And there's tons of people who use linear ramp on those long range characters and completely dominate. But it's just something to take into consideration when picking the best aiming technique for you. Okay, so now what is the second con? So the second con is linear ramp can be kind of difficult to control. And it's because of its lack of dead zone. It can feel very shaky and very wobbly at times. But luckily, we don't actually have to worry about that too much because we can actually just adjust some settings to minimize that. And that leads us perfectly into our next topic, which is what are the adjustments you should make to linear ramp to get the most out of it. So we're going to be making 3 adjustments to linear ramp. First adjustment that we're going to make is lowering your aim smoothing. And what that's going to do is just going to make it feel more responsive and get closer to that one-to-one feel. Second change that we're going to be making is we're going to add a little bit of aim easing. And so what that's going to do is it's going to fix the lack of dead zone by adding a little bit of a dead zone, and that's going to help just make our aim a bit less shaky. And especially if you have stick drift, you definitely want some dead zone. And the second thing it's going to do is just going to make it a bit easier to aim by adjusting the curve of linear ramp slightly. So the last change that we're going to make is we're going to decrease our horizontal and vertical sense. And what that's going to do is just going to make it a bit easier to control. And with linear ramp, it's usually a bit better to stick with the lower horizontal and vertical sense, just because the linear ramp is so responsive, there's really no need to max out your horizontal and vertical sense. But that's it for linear ramp. So now let's move on to the next aiming technique that we'll be talking about, and that is exponential ramp. So let's start with how exponential ramp actually works. So exponential ramp works by creating a curved ramp up where your aim starts off slow, and as your thumbstick moves more outward, your aim speeds up exponentially until you actually reach your maximum turn speed. Now that we understand how exponential ramp works, what are its pros and cons? So let's first talk about exponential ramp's pros. First is exponential ramp is generally good for tracking. And the second pro of exponential ramp is that it's pretty good at aiming up close, but it can be kind of stiff. So you just got to keep that in mind. But that's it for pros. So now let's move on to the cons. The first con of exponential ramp is that it can have very awkward transitions as your aim's ramping up, which can be super annoying. The second con of exponential ramp is that similar to linear ramp, it can struggle at that mid to long range, and it's also due in part to those really awkward transitions. But what are the adjustments that we can make to exponential ramp to make it feel better? So there's really only one adjustment that we can make, and it's decreasing aim smoothing. And what that's going to do is it's just going to help with the slow turn speed that a lot of people complain about. But other than that, there's really not much you can do. So that's it for Exponential Ramp. But now, let's move on to the final and most popular aiming technique, dual zone. So like we did with all of the other aiming techniques, let's start with how dual zone works. The way that dual zone works is like the name implies. It creates two zones that actually affect your aim speed differently. And in the first zone, which is about 90% of your thumbstick's range, your sense will increase linearly, but will be slower than your max sense. And when you reach the second zone, which is about the last 10% of your stick range, your sense will instantly reach its max turn speed. So now let's talk about dual zone's pros and cons. The first pro of dual zone is its versatility. Dual zone is decent for tracking, maybe not as good as linear ramp, but still is no slouch, and is also still really good for sniping. The second pro of dual zone is its amazing balance of speed and precision. Dual zone just allows you to use a faster sense without sacrificing control and precision, which is probably why it's the most popular aiming technique. But now that we covered dual zone's pros, let's talk about its cons. Dual zone's main con is that it just really struggles with aiming up close. It's probably due to dual zone's unique two-zone system, which can make it hard to make those necessary micro adjustments that are needed for aiming up close. But that's it for pros and cons. So now let's talk about adjustments for dual zone. There's really only one adjustment that I could come up with, which is just trying to find an aim smoothing that suits you the best. And other than that, there's really not much to change. Dual zone is a very good, well-rounded aiming technique that doesn't need many changes. And that's probably the reason why it's the default aiming technique in Overwatch. But that's it. That was the last aiming technique. So if you learned something, please do consider subbing to the channel because it really helps me out. And whenever we do actually hit 1,000 subs, I'll be doing some type of giveaway. But other than that, I just wanted to thank you for watching the video and making it to the end. So hopefully I see you in the next one.